Chapter 18, The Parts That Really Matter. In mid-September, Joe returned from Grand Coulee with enough money to make it through another year. Joyce had abruptly left her job that summer after the judge had taken an inappropriate interest in her and chased her around the dining table one afternoon. Luckily, she found work with another family nearby. The new job started off on an uncertain note. On the first evening, the lady of the house, Mrs. Tellwright, asked her to make a difficult dish, duck à l'orange, for dinner. Joyce was horrified. She knew what a duck was and what an orange was, but nothing about how to bring them together in a recipe. Mrs. Tellwright found Joyce's effort to be pretty much inedible. Instead of firing her, though, she quietly pulled Joyce aside and suggested that the two of them take cooking classes together. They did, and that turned out to be the beginning of a long and happy friendship. Joe resumed visiting his father at the bakery, and Harry mentioned again that he and Thula sometimes took trips by themselves, which meant Joe could visit his half-siblings without worrying about Thula throwing him out of the house. The first time he and Joyce visited, though, they were shocked. They found that his father and Thula had been gone for 3 straight days, and the kids were hungry, almost entirely out of food. Harry Jr., the oldest at 13, said that his parents had packed a pressure cooker full of stewed beef, potatoes, and vegetables, taken a loaf of bread and some canned goods, and gone to Medical Lake in eastern Washington. He didn't know when they might return. Joe and Joyce took the kids out for ice cream, then bought some basic provisions before dropping them back home. By the next day, when Joe drove by to check, Harry and Thula had returned, but he could not figure out what they'd been thinking. Apparently, this had been going on all summer long. Thula had begun to pursue her dream of becoming a violinist. That summer, she'd had an audition with a major violinist in Los Angeles, and a local radio station had aired a series of her live performances. Now she was bent on getting out of the house, celebrating and enjoying her successes. Joe headed back to the Shell House to get in shape for what was to come. Johnny White and Chuck Day showed up too, dusty and tan from Grand Coulee. Coach Ulberkson was back as well, and his desire for Olympic gold had only grown stronger over the summer. He told his wife in private that if he didn't fetch gold in Berlin in 1936, he planned to quit coaching. To pull it off, though, he knew he had to find 9 young men of exceptional strength, grace, endurance, and most of all, mental toughness. They would have to row almost flawlessly in long races and short, under all kinds of conditions. They would have to live well together in close quarters for weeks at a time. They would have to perform on the most prominent stage in the sport, in full view of the whole world. He believed he had such boys somewhere at the Shell House, but he had not identified them yet. To find that ideal crew, Ulberkson had begun to turn to George Pocock for advice. At some point that fall, as he talked to Pocock, the subject of Joe Rance came up. Ulberkson had been studying Joe for a year now, ever since Tom Bowles had told him about the boy. Since then, Ulberkson had tried everything. He'd scolded Joe, encouraged him, demoted him, promoted him, but he wasn't any closer to understanding the mystery of Joe Rance. There were days when he rode like quicksilver, so smooth and fluid and powerful that he seemed a part of the boat and his oar in the water all at once. But there were other days when he was downright lousy, when he seemed to row as if his mind were somewhere else, lost in his own little world. Now Ulberkson asked Pocock to take a look at the boy. He wanted Pocock to talk to him, to try to figure him out, and if possible, to fix him. On a bright, crisp September morning, as Pocock started up the steps to his loft in the Shell House, he noticed Joe doing sit-ups on a bench at the back of the room. He motioned Joe to come over, said he'd noticed him peering up into the workshop occasionally. He asked if he'd like to look around. Joe was thrilled. Like Pocock, he loved working with wood, and he wanted desperately to see the shop. He all but bounded up the stairs. The loft was bright and airy, with morning light pouring in from 2 large windows in the back wall. The air was thick with the sweet, sharp scent of marine varnish. Drifts of sawdust and curls of wood shavings lay on the floor. An 8-oared shell was under construction in the center of the room. Pocock started off by explaining the various tools he used. He showed Joe his wood planes, their wooden handles burnished by decades of use, their blades so sharp and precise that they could shave off curls of wood as thin and transparent as tissue paper. He handed him tools he'd brought over from England, some of which were a century old. He guided Joe to a lumber rack and pulled out samples of soft, malleable sugar pine, hard yellow spruce, fragrant cedar, and clear white ash. Joe grew mesmerized. It wasn't just what the Englishman was saying. It was the way he talked about the wood, as if it was holy and sacred. He told of how the trees had grown in all sorts of conditions, endured lightning strikes and windstorms and infestations. Pocock said the wood taught us about survival, about overcoming difficulty, but it also taught us about the reasons for surviving in the first place. Something about infinite beauty, about things larger and greater than ourselves. "Sure, I can make a boat," he said, and then added, quoting the poet Joyce Kilmer, "but only God can make a tree." Pocock pulled out a thin sheet of cedar, one that had been milled down to 3/8 of an inch. The sheet would form the skin of a shell. Pocock flexed the wood and had Joe do the same. He talked about the underlying strength of the individual fibers in the wood. He said those separate fibers, knitted together in the wood, gave cedar its ability to bounce back and resume its shape or take on a new one. The ability to yield, to bend, to give way, Pocock said, was sometimes a source of strength in men as well as in wood. Pocock stepped back and studied the shell he was building. To build a boat, he told Joe, you had to give yourself up to it spiritually. You had to surrender yourself absolutely to your work. Leave a part of your heart in it. He turned to Joe. Rowing, he said, is like that. And a lot of life is like that too. The parts that really matter anyway. Do you know what I mean, Joe? Joe nodded, but he was still not at all certain that he did. He went back downstairs and resumed his sit-ups, trying to work it out. Varsity practice did not begin officially until October 21st. In the meantime, Joe and Joyce paddled canoes around the bay, window shopped downtown, went to the movies, and stopped by his father's house whenever Harry and Thula were away. When they could, they'd take Joe's half-siblings out for quick picnics on Green Lake, then rush the kids back home before Harry and Thula returned. Joe spent much of his free time at the Shell House exercising and tossing a football around with Johnny White, Chuck Day, Roger Morris, and Shorty Hunt. He'd found another friend in Stub McMillan, the gangly number 5 man from the previous year's JV boat. Joe would often linger at the Shell House late into the evening, and one night he came out of the steam room to find Stub pushing a broom. When Joe realized Stub was working at the as the Shell House janitor, he sauntered over and stuck out his hand. As they talked, Joe confided what he had long kept secret from the other boys. He told Stub that he was now a janitor too, working a late-night shift at the YMCA. When varsity practice began, the previous season's rivalries and hard feelings and insecurities erupted again. There was no fiery speech from Coach Albrechtsen this time. There was no need for it. Everyone knew exactly what the stakes were this year. Albrechtsen gathered all the boys on the ramp, straightened his tie, and announced that there would be no set boats. He was going to mix and match the boys until he found the ideal crew. Until then, it was going to be every man for himself. For the next few weeks, Joe bumped back and forth between the 3rd and 4th boats. He was rowing hard, but his spirits were starting to flag. He missed the camaraderie that had grown among his classmates after 2 years of rowing together. He missed Shorty Hunt sitting behind him whispering, "Don't worry, Joe, I've got your back," whenever Albrechtsen yelled at him. He missed gruff Roger Morris, who rarely said a word but was always there for him. Joe hadn't really thought before about how much it mattered to him that those 2 fellows were in the boat with him, but it turned out that it did matter a lot. He had the same feeling every time he watched his grand coolie buddy, Johnny White, sweep by him in another boat, part of something else now, part of a crew of boys dead set on defeating him. When he was abandoned in Squim, he promised himself he'd never depend on anyone else, not even on Joyce, for his happiness or his sense of who he was. Now he began to see that he'd allowed himself to do exactly that, with the useful, painful results. He hadn't expected it, he hadn't prepared for it, and now the ground seemed to be shifting under him in an unpredictable way. Then, just a few days into the season, the ground shifted again. Joe learned that Thula was dead, killed by an infection. He was numb. He didn't know what to think or to feel. Although she'd abandoned him and turned him away, Thula had been the closest thing to a mother that he had known since he was 3. There had been at least some good times back in Spokane when they had all sat together on the big swing in the backyard. Over the years, he had wondered what he might have done to make things better between them. Now he would never know. Mostly, though, he worried about how his father, and even more his half-siblings, would cope with the change. The next morning, Joe went by his father's house. He found his father and the kids sitting at a picnic table on a soggy lawn. They talked for a while about Thula's life. Joe told his father how sorry he was. Finally, Harry turned abruptly to Joe and said, "Son, I've got a plan. I'm going to build a house where we can all live together. As soon as it's done, I want you to come home." Joe sat at the table staring at his father. He did not know what to make of the proposal. He did not know if he could trust the man. He stammered out a vague answer. They talked some more about Thula. Joe told the kids that he would be coming by more often to keep them company from now on. But he drove back to the YMCA that night, not sure what to do. Slowly his confusion turned to anger, which gave way again to confusion, and then anger again, all of it washing over him in waves. Chapter 19. A Truth to Come to Terms With. The rest of the fall season was grueling, and the boys rowed and raced in weather that had again turned unusually cold and stormy. Joe's boat often finished 3rd. He was struggling with his emotions, especially since Thula had died, and his father had invited him to move home. Then he got a letter from Sequim. Charlie McDonald was dead, too, killed in an automobile crash. Charlie had been an advisor and a teacher to Joe, the one adult who had stood by him when no one else had. Now he was gone, and Joe found himself unable to focus. His mind was almost never in the boat, and it showed in his rowing. But it didn't seem to matter. As far as Joe could tell, no one in the coach's motorboat was even paying attention to him anymore. But in fact, someone was watching him very closely. Joe had noticed that Pocock was riding along in the motorboat frequently these days, but he hadn't noticed where Pocock had been training his binoculars. When the boys returned to the shell house after Christmas break, Ulbrichtson warned them that they must be ready to take part in Washington's greatest and most grueling crew season. After months of talking about the Olympic year, it was finally here. On the first Monday of the new season, Joe was surprised to find his name listed among those in the number 1 varsity boat. He couldn't fathom why he had suddenly been promoted. As it turned out, it wasn't really much of a promotion. Ulbrichtson planned to spend the first few weeks working on technique and fundamentals, and he believed the boys would be more receptive if they were rowing with familiar crewmates. So Joe was back with the boys from freshman year, including Shorty Hunt and Roger Morris. Through January and into February, they rowed 6 days a week. They worked on individual weaknesses. When it wasn't snowing, it was clear, bitter cold, and windy. Icicles dangled from the bow of the boat. They rowed anyway, with white knuckles and chattering teeth. Some of them dressed in ragged sweatsuits, some in shorts and stocking caps. Occasionally, they staged short races against each other, and Joe's boat kept coming in third. The third boat kept coming in first. In general, Ulbrichtson was pleased. By late February, he was starting to form some solid ideas about what his Olympic boat would look like. One choice was obvious. No matter what, Bobby Mock, the clever, fiery coxswain from the previous year's JV crew, was going to be sitting in the stern. At 5'7" and 119 pounds, he was almost the perfect size for a coxswain. Pocock, in fact, designed his shells to perform best with a 120-pound coxswain. Despite his small frame, a coxswain had to be strong enough to steer the boat. He had to know enough about the oarsmen inside, their individual strengths and weaknesses, to get the most out of each rower at any given moment. And he had to have the force of character to inspire exhausted rowers to try harder, even when all seemed lost. Bobby Mock had proven he could do all of this the previous year. He had a deep baritone voice that was surprising in a man so small, and he bellowed out commands with absolute authority. Most important, he was smart and he knew how to use his smarts. Joe's situation, on the other hand, was only getting worse. In late February, he was dropped to the number 2 boat. On February 20th, rowing hard and in a heavy snow and a steady east wind, the first 2 boats came in about even. Joe's hopes rose. But a week later, Ulbrichtson moved him down to the number 3 boat. One stormy afternoon in early March after practice, George Pocock tapped Joe on the shoulder and asked him to come up into the loft again. Upstairs, Pocock leaned over one side of a new shell and began to apply varnish to its upturned hull. Joe pulled a sawhorse to the other side and sat down on it facing the older man. Pocock began by saying he'd been closely watching Joe row for a while now, that he was a fine oarsman. He noted a few technical faults, but that wasn't what he wanted to talk about. He said that there were times when Joe seemed to think he was the only one in the boat. He rowed as if it were up to him to row the boat across the finish line all by himself. When a man rowed like that, Pocock said, he was bound to attack the water rather than to work with it. Worse, he would not be able to let his crew help him row. The Englishman suggested that Joe think of a well-rowed race as a symphony, and himself as just one player in the orchestra. If one fellow in the orchestra was playing out of tune or playing at a different tempo, the whole piece would naturally be ruined. That's the way it was with rowing. What mattered more than how hard a man rowed was how well everything he did in the boat harmonized with what the other fellows were doing. And a man couldn't harmonize with his crewmates unless he opened his heart to them. He had to care about everyone on his crew. He had to give himself up to the rowing, but he had to do it even more. He had to give himself up to his crewmates, too. If you don't like some fellow in the boat, Joe, you have to learn to like him, Pocock said. It has to matter to you whether he wins the race, not just whether you do. Pocock paused and looked up. Joe, when you really start trusting those other boys, Pocock said, you will feel a power at work within you that is far beyond anything you've ever imagined. Sometimes you will feel as if you have rowed right off the planet and are rowing among the stars. The next day was a Sunday, and Joe took Joyce and drove over to a lot on Lake Washington where his father was building his new house. The land was right next to his brother Fred's house, and for the past few weekends, Joe had been helping his father work. The basement was nearly complete, and with the upstairs portion underway, Harry had moved the kids in downstairs. The basement was more like a cave than a house, but Harry had lugged in a wood stove, and it was warm and dry inside. As Joe worked with his father, hauling lumber down from the road in a driving rain, Joyce entertained the kids, playing card games and making fudge and cocoa on the stove. Playing mother to foolish children was natural to Joyce. The children were grief-stricken, and Harry's full-time work on the house prevented him from giving them the attention they needed. Every instinct Joyce had led her to sweep them into her arms and care for them, but her feelings about Harry were different. Even though he treated Joyce pleasantly, inside she still seethed with resentment toward him. She could not forgive him for his failure to stand behind Joe for all those years. By late afternoon, after they had moved all the lumber into position, Joe stood outside on the dock by himself, staring out at the lake. The finish line for the Pacific Coast Regatta in April was a little less than a mile up the lake from there. He wondered if he would be in the varsity boat when it passed by this dock. A gust of wind struck him. Rain poured down his face. He stared at the water, pondering what Pocock had told him the day before. Joe had spent the last 6 years making his own way in the world. Nothing was more frightening than allowing himself to depend on others. People let you down. People left you behind. Depending on people and trusting them got you hurt. But trust seemed to be at the heart of what Pocock was saying. Harmonize with the other fellows, he said. There was a kind of absolute truth in that. It was something Joe couldn't deny. He had to come to terms with it. He stood on the dock for a long time, gazing at the lake, oblivious to the rain. Then he turned and peered back at the house. Inside, the kids and Joyce and his father were all under one roof, sitting in front of the fire, waiting for him to come in. When he returned to the warm cave, he toweled dry, unpacked his banjo, and gathered the kids around. He tuned the banjo carefully, then he cleared his throat, cracked open a big white smile, and began to play and sing. One by one, the kids, then his father, and finally Joyce began to join in, singing along with him. By March 19th, Albrechtsen figured he had found his best bet for an Olympic boat. He still had it pegged as the second boat on his chalkboard, but the boys in it were beginning to edge the first boat consistently. Bobby Mock was riding coxswain. Roger Morris was in the bow, followed by Chuck Day and Gordy Adam in the engine room. Albrechtsen had placed Johnny White at number 4, Stug McMillan in the 5 seat, and Shorty Hunt at number 6. Merton Hatch, another of Tom Bull's former freshmen, sat in the 7 seat. The star of last year's freshman crew, Don Hume, was the stroke oar. Joe was in the 3rd boat, and it looked as if he'd be staying there and staying home, not rowing in the Cal race or beyond. But then, on March 21st, he walked into the shell house and found his name on the chalkboard, sitting at seat number 7 in boat number 2, right between Shorty Hunt and Don Hume. He couldn't believe it. He didn't know if Pocock had talked to Albrechtsen or if Merton Hatch had simply messed up in some terrible way. Whatever the reason, he had had his chance. He knew what he had to do. From the moment he stepped into the shell that afternoon, he felt at home. He liked these boys. He didn't know Gordy Adam and Don Hume well, but both made a point of welcoming him abroad. His oldest, most reliable shellhouse friend, Roger Morris, sitting up front in the bow, gave him a wave and shouted, "Hey, Joe, see you finally found the right boat." His buddies from Grand Coulee, Chuck Day and Johnny White, were sitting up near the front, too. When he saw Joe, Stub McMillan, his face alight, said, "Okay, this boat is going to fly now, boys." Shorty Hunt slapped him on the back and whispered, "Got your back, Joe." Chapter 20. Finding Their Swing. On that first day out with the new crew, Joe rowed as he had never been able to row before. He rowed as Pocock had told him to row, giving himself up to the crew's effort entirely, merging with it, becoming one with it. He followed Hume's stroke flawlessly, sending it back to Shorty behind him in one continuous flow. It felt to Joe like a transformation, as if some kind of magic had come over him. As he climbed out of the boat, he realized that he didn't need to struggle to give himself up to the rhythm of the boat, as Pocock had urged him to do. With this bunch of boys, he did not even have to try. He just trusted them. In the end, it was that simple. Over the next few days, the boat began to fly, just as Stubbs said it would. Racing the other crews, the boat won by an astonishing 7 lengths one day, 3 lengths another day. They won sprints, they won in wind, they won in snow, and on March 28th, Albrechtsen officially declared that they were the new varsity boat. If he was going to get to the Olympics, this was the crew that was going to take him there. That afternoon, George Pocock personally christened the new shell in which the boys would row. As Joe and his crewmates held it aloft, Pocock poured a jar full of mysterious fluid over its bow and pronounced, "I christen this boat Husky Clipper. May it have success in all the waters it speeds over, especially in Berlin." As the boys began to carry the boat down the ramp to the water, some of them crinkled their noses, trying to make out the odd scent of the fluid on the bow. Pocock chuckled and grinned. "Sauerkraut juice," he said, "to get it used to Germany." 2 weeks before the Pacific Coast Regatta, Albrechtsen held one final 3-mile time trial. The course record was then 16:33.4, but Joe and his crewmates finished it faster at 16:20, and they did it sitting upright at the end of the race, breathing easy, feeling good. Every time they climbed into the Husky Clipper together, they just seemed to get better. There was a straightforward reason for what was happening. The boys in the Husky Clipper were all tough, they were all skilled, they were all fiercely determined, but they were also all good-hearted. Every one of them had come from humble origins or had been humbled by the hard demands of rowing. Life and the challenges they had faced together had also taught them humility, that there were limits to their individual powers. They had learned that there were things they could do far better together than alone. They were starting to row now for one another, not just themselves, and it made all the difference. Kai Bright and the boys from Cal arrived in Seattle on April 14th. The next day, when they showed up to row, the sun was out in full force, and the water was glass smooth. As they carried their shells down the ramp to the water, the national champion Cowboys were an intimidating sight. They had been rowing well under the California sun, and they were tanned and fit. A week earlier, they had rowed a 3-mile time trial in 16:15, a good 5 seconds better than Albrechtson's crew. But Ebright knew to take the Washington boys seriously. That first day, he jumped into the coxswain's seat of his varsity boat, a Pocock crafted shell called the California Clipper, and barked commands himself during an 8-mile practice row. On race day, Saturday, April 18th, the skies were flawlessly blue. The weather was warm. A ferry packed with students and the school's marching band left the dock in the early afternoon. A Navy cruiser and nearly 400 other vessels flying purple and gold pennants gathered near the finish line. On the dock at Fred's house, right next to Harry's new home, Joyce and the kids and Harry sat eating peanuts and tossing the shells into the lake. By 2:15 p.m., when an observation train rolled into place, the largest crowd ever to witness a crew race in the Northwest had assembled along the race course. The Washington freshmen did not disappoint, setting a new course record and winning by 4.5 lengths. In the next race, Washington's JV boat took the lead easily at the start and crossed the line almost 6 lengths ahead of California, again setting a new course record. At 4:15 p.m., the two varsity crews paddled out to the starting line. A tailwind had stiffened, piling rough water into heaps of whitecaps at the north end of the lake. So far, all the boats on the course that day had broken course records, even the losing crews. The bodies of the oarsmen were catching the wind, acting as sails, hurrying the shells down the course. At the starting line, the Husky Clipper bobbed in the swells. Roger Morris and Gordy Adam up front kept the bow of the boat pointed due north. Bobby Mock lowered his hand to indicate his crew was ready to row. Over in the cow boat, the coxswain did the same. The starter shouted, "Row!" and both boats bolted off the line. The big cowstroke, Gene Birkenkamp, who had mowed Washington down in 2 races the previous year, quickly powered his crew to a short lead. For 3/4 of a mile, the two crews rowed at the same speed, both furiously digging at the choppy water. Don Hume was matching Birkenkamp's stroke rate, but making no progress in overtaking him. Then Bobby Mock had a daring idea. Cal was ahead and rowing hard, but he told Hume to lower the stroke count. Hume dropped it to 29. Almost immediately, the boys found their swing. Don Hume set the model, taking huge, smooth, deep pulls. Joe and the rest of the boys fell in behind him. Very slowly, seat by seat, the Husky Clipper began to regain water on the California Clipper. By the 1-mile mark, the two boats were even. The Cal coxswain called out, "Give me 10 big ones." Bobby Mock hunched down in the stern, looked Don Hume in the eyes, and growled at him to keep steady at 29. With the wind in their faces pushing them along, both crews were flying down the course now. Spray was breaking over the bow of their shells as they skipped from wave to wave. Cal was rowing at 31 strokes per minute, but even with its slower rate, Washington continued to inch ahead. The Cal coxswain called for another big 10, but Bobby Mock held steady, and Washington maintained its small lead. In Washington's number 7 seat, Joe realized he was nearing his father's house. He was tempted to sneak a peek over his shoulder, but he didn't. He kept his mind in the boat. Washington moved out to a 3/4 length lead. The Cal coxswain called on his boys to give him more. They raised their stroke rate to 35, then 36. Mock continued to hold steady at 29. Finally, with a half-mile to go, Mock bellowed at Hume to pick up Washington's rate. The Husky Clipper surged forward, and in the last half-mile they accelerated in a way that no shell had ever accelerated on Lake Washington. As they flew down the last few hundred yards, the boys rocked back and forth, perfectly in sync. Hundreds of boat whistles shrieked. The locomotive on the observation train wailed. Students on the ferry screamed, and a long, sustained roar went up from the tens of thousands standing along the beach as the Husky Clipper crossed the line 3 lengths ahead of California, beating the course record by 37 seconds. As the crowds around him cheered, Al Albrechtson sat quietly in his boat at the finish line, listening to the band play the school's fight song. His boys had beaten a very good California crew, the defending national champions. They had rowed better than ever. They were truly an out-of-the-ordinary group, but it was too early to see whether the magic would hold. 2 years running now, his varsity had beaten Ebright's in the Pacific Coast Regatta, only to lose at the national championships in Poughkeepsie. Who was to say that this bunch wouldn't do the same?